Good afternoon, and thank you once again for coming to the conference. We are approaching the end of it, but we saved the best for last. It's a special privilege to introduce and welcome friend and colleague Cecilia Rouse. She is going to be our keynote speaker, and we are going to engage in a conversation and then open up for question and answers. She's currently the president of Brookings Institution, but she has really a long and distinguished career as an academic, as a public servant, and really leading from the front, both in terms of academic leadership, but then also leadership in public service. Before she was the president of Brookings, she made history as chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under the Biden administration from 2021 to 2023. That was not her first stint in Washington. Before that, she was also in the Council of Economic Advisors as a member from 2009 to 2011, and then as special assistant to the president at the National Economic Council from 1998 to 1999. And in between that, in case you were wondering that she was not doing much, she was the dean of the public policy school here, SPIA as it is now called, Woodrow Wilson School as it was called back then. She was the dean of our school from 2012 to 2021. And of course, throughout this time, she was also a faculty member in the economics as well as the public policy school at Princeton. Prior to that, she graduated first undergrad and then with a PhD in economics from Harvard University. So Cece has spanned a vast area, both on the academic side, doing cutting-edge research, especially in the area of education, and then obviously making her mark in public service as well. And what is especially of interest for the topic of this conference, we have been talking about industrial policy, of course. And one of the graphs, I think Nathan showed that graph, that the usage of industrial policy or the conversation about industrial policy has really skyrocketed since the pandemic. And she was very much in the thick of things as chair of Council of Economic Advisors when all of this stuff that we talked about, the IRA and the CHIPS Act, was getting legislated and passed through Congress and implemented in practice in real time. So I'm sure she has a lot to sort of tell us what was happening, revisiting some of those issues, and that's the conversation we want to have. And we, as I said, I'll open up for question and answers as well. So Cece, please, if you can join me, thank you.
Great. Do I get to say it's great to be here, it's really great to be here because JRCPPF was really kind of nascent when I first became dean of the school, and this conference was still kind of, it's in its infancy, and it's just so fabulous to see such a, just really timely conference, but also just phenomenal content. So congratulations to you, Atif. You've been at the helm the entire time, and obviously a thanks to Mitch for making this all happen. So it's absolutely a pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I like that sort of coming full circle, so to speak. So that's nice. I want to start with sort of the obvious question, right? What was going on inside the administration when you joined? I think you were still on Zoom when you joined, right?
Yeah.
But obviously industrial policy had become a big question, an issue that the administration pushed. If you could tell us something about the motivation and the thinking that was going on, how were the decisions made, the ones that were made, and perhaps some that were not made? What was the conversation like?
So it's a good question. First, I would argue a lot of this was developed during the campaign. So as much as we may be looking at Trump 2.0 and saying, look how organized they are coming in, they knew what they wanted to do, there was Project 2025, the Biden administration came in with day one plans, 100-day plans, executive orders, and a lot of the legislative thinking had been done during the campaign, and quite frankly, that is some of what drew me to go, because I didn't think I was going to go back. But I was really motivated by the following, which I think underlies some of this, which is it had been my observation that over the last, from Reagan, whatever, sort of I hate labels because I'm never going to get it right, but like the neoliberalism, how we're thinking about it was really this idea that the private sector usually gets it right. The public sector needs to be small, and I'm not going to argue for big public sector, so I'm not trying to argue for big government here. But, we teach in basic economics and basic micro that the private sector, that there are holes for the private sector. This is what Joe Stiglitz was talking about last night, right? That there are market failures, or, in terms of externalities and all the things. And so that there is a role, Milton Friedman said this in Capitalism and Freedom, there is a role for the public sector in having a thriving economy. And it was my view that we had ceded too much and that the public sector was not stepping up. In fact, while I was on leave from being dean, and I think my leave coincided like literally to the day with the pandemic, so that was quite a leave. I wrote a piece that it couldn't get placed anywhere, so it's on Medium, which is like, government is not a dirty word. I think the pandemic really highlighted this, hello, people I'm not expecting to see in the audience here, really highlighted, with you have a pandemic where you have this negative externality, you need coordination, even if you think of the development of the vaccines, which started with basic science, and then it had to be handed off to the private sector for scale and commercialization, although we got that even with Operation Warp Speed, from the combination of the grants up front to help, bring this to further develop the, I never get this right after 5 years, and I really should, mRNA technology, and to apply it for this novel virus. And then there was the guaranteed market at the other end for for those who developed a vaccine that was effective, we will, the government was going to buy. So that was a powerful role of government in helping us in record time go from a virus that was unknown to the human body to having a vaccine, which ultimately turned out to be pretty effective. So there's a role for the public sector. I felt like that's what President Biden was trying to recognize as well. He articulated that many times. He felt that when he says he wants to be FDR, a lot of, okay, this is Cece channeling the president, which maybe I shouldn't do, but that there was a recognition that there is an important role for the government and working hand in glove. So, in terms of the industrial policy, in terms of, so industrial policy per se, but that's what underlay the infrastructure investments. People mock the human infrastructure a bit, and I want to defend that to the death. I think that that's part of the innovation we need to do. Maybe not to the death, but okay. And so the industrial policy, I think, was a recognition that we had some really big problems in our economy. We have inequality, which was just, we're one of the more unequal economies in the world. We could see that very clearly, that it was affecting certain groups in our society more than others. So you have Angus Deaton and Ann Case with their deaths of despair. It was well known, even under Obama, Larry Summers had a working group, and I don't know if this is publicly known, but he had a working group on like the declining labor force participation of men due to in rural areas and formerly industrial base and manufacturing areas, which is coinciding with the deaths of despair and the lack of activity. We had growing evidence that this was partially due to the accession of China to the WTO and globalization and technology and all the things that we economists believe increase the size of the pie. And yet, what's happening? And yet the other part, I thought this is where Joe was going to go last night with the first theorem. Like, okay, well, when we have efficiency, if you can't get first best, the second best is the winners compensate the losers. Right, that's part of our definition of why an action is we think of as economically efficient. And many people have said to me, yes, no, we got that right. Technology, globalization, increase in technology, all that's right. That is pie increasing. It's domestic policy that has failed us. That is true. We don't redistribute, but how do we redistribute? Right? We don't tax in this country. It's not going to be about universal basic income, if you ask me. because I think that's a problem. So what are we talking about for the redistribution? So this is one mechanism to try to address some of that inequality. May or not, we can have many debates about whether we think it's going to be effective or not. We heard some of that today, and some of it, hints of it yesterday. But that was part of, how do we generate some economic activity in some of the more rural parts of the country where we haven't seen as much activity? How do we bring back, and we can argue whether manufacturing jobs is the right way to think about this. And, manufacturing was dominant in our economy many moons ago. It's probably not quite the right way to be thinking about it going forward. But, the idea was, how do we generate good jobs for people who are probably not going to be working, I'm going to be very crude here, changing adult diapers and working in the service, which we know we're going to be needing that too. And so how do we generate these good jobs that people will want to do and have a good life in doing? Combined with the fact we've been through this pandemic and we saw the challenge that supply chains could have being over-reliant on external partners, especially if you have to cross an ocean, and then if you don't know if you can count on them. And we had these critical components that could go right to our national security, vulnerability. And then finally, you have the national security layered right on top of that, which my own view on national security risks is, it's not my business. I got to see some of the intelligence reports, et cetera. I don't know how to judge how good or not, right? They're making estimates and forecasting guess just like we do. I will say that Israel's use of the mobile phones in Lebanon, I think for any of us who really wanted to dismiss and discount national security risks, have to just raise that as didn't see that coming. And so there are these there are the unknowns that I'm not saying that they're right, but I'm just going to say I think at our peril, we dismiss not being quite paranoid enough. We compare others. So I think you layer all that on, and industrial policy, it got laden.
So can I just interject a little on this? Because it's the way you are describing industrial policy in the US context is very different from industrial policy, the way Korea might have thought of it in the 70s and 80s, or how the conversation yesterday on Africa, they might think of industrial policy, because there is how do we get growth? We just want to get richer, right? So that's sort of one. Yeah. The two reasons you mentioned was very interesting. Korea would never mention it by and large. Africa would never mention it by and large, and those are inequality and national security. So the reason or the motivation for industrial policy is very different in the US context as opposed to the rest of the world. So given that you've been talking about industrial policy, I thought that is sort of an interesting contrast between this session and sort of what we have been talking about earlier.
Good point.
Now, in that context, since you mentioned national security, so now let's come to the US. So like you said, the motivation is inequality, but it's you want to, I think there's a word like my colleague Eliana, she has a nice paper with Suresh on pre-distribution versus post-distribution. It's that's one way of thinking about it.
Yep.
So it's how do we change the structure of the economy so that growth becomes more equitable, as opposed to then trying to do this post-tax and transfer thing, which has many issues, and that's not, we don't want people to live on handouts if they can have a good earning. And so that's and with AI and so on, that's just sort of, doubling down on that kind of challenge. And so, with the benefit of hindsight, I'll come to the national security question as well. I want to think of the CHIPS Act and so on in that context. But just to take inequality for a moment, in hindsight, and having gone through the experience, and obviously I'm sure you think about the consequences of what you did.
Personally, I personally did.
But how should we, it remains a very important question, equitable growth. How would you plan it out looking forward obviously with the hindsight?
So first, I think it's a little early to have complete hindsight. Right, I thought the last panel was interesting. I think we're starting to develop and we're starting to see some understanding of which approaches worked, which may not have worked. But I think it's still too early to fully judge literally what the hindsight is. It was interesting to hear, I think it was Frank, talk about all the other stuff that was laden on top of the CHIPS in terms of you have to do you have to pay the Davis-Bacon requirements, which, again, for President Biden, he was always going to do that. We can disagree with it, but he was going to do that because he doesn't just have one objective. And he was always going to be very supportive of unions. So he wasn't going to argue that they shouldn't have to pay prevailing wages. Then Secretary Raimondo layered on that they have to be required to provide child care or have free child care available or mandatory for child care. That caused an uproar. I thought that was maybe trying to establish, they're trying to deal with another piece of the Biden agenda in this indirect way, which I think I fall into the camp of. That was sort of ladening up. Let's be a little clearer on what the objective is. But I would, so I think it's a little early to literally judge. We also had the headwinds of coming out of the pandemic, so the timing may not have been perfect. So the cost of doing this building and this infrastructure when you had a red hot labor market, so finding the workers was not cheap. And then you had inflation, which meant the cost of materials was not cheap. So the cost and what we're getting for a dollar, there's a debate happening in the economic sphere between Jason Furman and others on, did we actually get less infrastructure investment over the last several years than we had before? Then there are those who argue he's using the wrong deflator, just to tell you how geeky this is getting. And so if you use the deflator that is most common, he was using an outlier deflator. It actually looks like he did increase infrastructure investment, not as much if we didn't have the inflation and the higher costs. So the timing is wrong. But I would argue this was worth trying. So it's funny that we talk about the concern that government starts to, in the light of the Solyndra failure, and so there's this real concern in government not to have a zero tolerance for any failure. I think that's a shame. I think government is where we should be able to tolerate some risk, because I think that's one of those things that the private sector doesn't do quite as well.
But then you come in New York Times headlines. So that
you do, exactly. But I think we need to somehow have institutions and structure which is that can tolerate some risk. And with that risk, so why not try some industrial policy?
Yeah.
Right? Because just because we weren't doing it doesn't mean that was the best way to do it. There's always opportunity cost, and doesn't mean that was the right way. And if we can't ever try something new, we will never innovate. So I am in the camp of this is worth trying.
But just since you brought it up, how do you, again, because the incentives are going to be if you do end up having one failure, the New York Times is going to pick up exactly on that and say Cecilia Rouse pushed it and it failed. Trump is going to stand up and say, or whoever the opposition is, but in your case it would be that's why I'm picking the president. They were to stand up and say, look, and so you're how do you get out of that equilibrium? That's what I'm trying to ask.
They don't pay me to do that, actually. But here's what I would push back on. So first of all, let's take President Trump. He's spinning upside down, his right side up. I mean, there are ways to talk and communicate. I think in this, and wait, who's here who studies it? Wait, the energy loan program, right? I think that the U.S. taxpayer made net positive returns from that program. And that is not known. We had Tesla. There were many other loans that they made. I think he said that they returned more dollars than were spent out. That was a positive investment. So why aren't we talking about that? So yeah, let the New York Times grab on, because that's how they get their headlines. And first of all, you have communications offices. Okay, hey, New York Times, write a balanced story and push back on it. But let's tell the good parts story, because there are good parts here. That's why he talked about that as being a good version of what we were doing. Mm-hmm. So I think that's on us, but you have to have some capacity to do that.
So let's talk a bit about the national security and sort of pushing industrial policy through that lens. Was that the main focus of the CHIPS Act?
That was a lot of the concern.
So how would you evaluate that question? There was some conversation before on if China does X, then what is the ripple effect on the US? And if we do this policy, then that ripple effect is different. Was there a lot of that kind of analysis and conversation, or is it more a hunch that okay, this is going to help?
So you sort of whispered that you might ask me this question beforehand. how much analysis was there. I don't know fully whether somebody like literally gamed out it all.
Yeah.
I mean, there was certainly some analysis about how we want to think about, not within the CEA, because I think this is beyond our expertise. You really have to, from the Department of Energy, Defense, et cetera, really understanding how these components are used, et cetera, and thinking about the, the market shares, et cetera. But, if you just look at that, first of all, we're highly reliant on Taiwan for the advanced chips. Taiwan is highly vulnerable. It was the first time I wrote this down. I was just in Taiwan. I don't think they're thinking that by 2027 that their country is no longer a separate country. I got to tell you that. I wrote that down. But they are nonetheless highly vulnerable to blockade, get absorption, whatever, with China. And if our military and many of our advanced systems are heavily reliant on these advanced chips, and we no longer have access to them, or now it's gotten absorbed under China in some way, and we no longer trust them, we're sunk. So even TSMC, I always get the letters wrong, is starting to diversify where they're producing. They're not just producing in Taiwan because they also recognize that there's this vulnerability. So I think it was in the spirit of we have to diversify. And I think that's, like, again, this is where it's above my pay grade, it's not my field. It's hard for me to understand, but I do see that concentration. I see that geopolitical risk with Taiwan and even, any country that we're gonna rely on for those advanced chips for which some of our most sensitive, military capability, and even just as we talk about artificial intelligence and all of the advancements gonna come, why would we want to be that heavily reliant on one or two sources?
Mm-hmm. On the geopolitical concerns more generally, like we talked about security, but there is the tariff issues, what people call like geoeconomics, just in terms of long-run alliance building.
Yeah.
That's a different nature of the question, right? That's not military equipment and things like that, but it's about, should we use economics as a tool for pushing countries closer to us or certain countries away from us?
So we're at Brookings, I can do that. I'm still on the faculty at Princeton, by the way.
I know that.
But we're actually working up a whole initiative on economic statecraft. I mean, that is, one way to think about it is that with all these different nuclear powers, and we're going to have more, I expect to see more, the use of military and military force, and also we talk about zero risk tolerance, losing humans and putting humans into war is really costly for leaders and for governments, and so military traditional statecraft, that the costs have gotten higher. And so, increasingly countries are turning to economic statecraft. I think that is where we are heading. I think this is where we have been heading. And I think we have to understand, and that we want to talk about gaming out, just like they do war games and they do figure out the simulations and I think we have to start thinking through, we put on the tariff, what's the retaliation and what's the knock-on? The reality is tariffs are very blunt, and you're perturbing a global system in a way that if you drop a bomb, that's much more localized. These weapons are going to have much more systemic effects, and so that's part of what I think we want to get our hands around. We are not alone. I think many people are starting to think about, in terms of tariffs and sanctions and all the other ways that we can try to get in there. And then there's a lot of concern about do we remain the dominant currency, and so that's going to go down in that areas too.
To what extent, you mentioned earlier when we were discussing security that some of it is like you're siloed into like, okay, this is a security question, and so the economists are not really in that conversation. But certainly, like a lot of these issues, the knock-on effects of tariffs and things like that, economists should be part of those geostrategic conversations and so on. Do you feel that at a structural level, we are built in a way that those conversations and thinking is facilitated? So we can talk about elasticities of substitution and things like that as we think through the ripple effects of these shocks?
So it's not that we're not in the room, because we are in the room, right? So we're in the room as those things are being debated. The question is, so we say, oh, we've overblown the risk of Huawei actually infiltrating our systems. You know, the economic benefits, we have the whole cost, but we've got jujitsu, we've got the full analysis on why this, you know, allowing their direct investment in the US is really, and the CIA comes in and says, yes, but we have intel, blah, 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 blah. What am I going to say?
Yeah.
I don't believe your intel. You're overblowing it.
Yeah.
Am I going to be responsible for the, you know, bringing down the electrical grid in the United States or whatever, having everybody's phone? I mean, you know, like that's what I'm referring to.
Right.
And so it's about the expertise. Now, so, you know, there's another point about having economists at the CIA. We actually had one detailed over, and I think I met a PhD student who was at the CIA, and I think that is a place where I think that those conversations can happen in a more at a grassroots level, so that they can, not that the economists are going to become expert on the national security data and the different forms of intelligence, and really, but they will be having those conversations day to day, which, you know, sitting at the CEA, I do not.
Yeah.
You know, I would get a briefing once a week, and what am I going to ask about? But really, is this human intelligence really credible? Can you talk to me about it? It's not my business.
Yeah.
So that is what I was really referring to.
So I'll ask one last question, and then we'll open up. This was a conversation we were having partly over lunch as well. I mean, the notion of industrial policy, chips, IRA, and so on, it's like you're focusing on perhaps what is in your control sitting in the White House. But if you ask the broader supply side question of how should the US restructure its supply side, the problems are actually with my local township. The problems are at the state level, like, you know, the housing. How can we build more housing? It's a clear issue. China is not responsible for that. Why can we not build infrastructure, high-speed rail? You know, why New Jersey Transit sucks the way it sucks, even 40 years after, 50 years after it was built. I mean, this is not China, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And this is not chips. Like, this is like, it's just like, and this is the stuff that really matters, also for inequality and things of that nature, if people can't commute, if they can't afford a house and things like that. And it's like to me, it's like, you know, it's like you can come in and you can say, okay, you know, this is going to happen, and these big war games and this and that, China this and Taiwan that. But excuse me, can I commute better? I mean, you know, it's like, so why can we not fix those problems?
When I got off at Trenton train station, there was a tarp over part of the escalator, and I thought, oh my goodness, really? We come to this? But Atif, I think that's part of the frustration of the American people with government, and you know, it's the federal government. I think they see more from their local governments, and I think they are more participatory in local governments. I think that is more accessible, but I think that is part of the frustration, is because we look around and we say, why can't we make these big leaps? Now, part of it is, you know, we got in there earlier. It's a lot harder to renovate. I stayed at the Nassau Inn last night, and I was thinking, boy, this carpet really is, you know, like it's a shame. You know, like we know that they've got a monopoly now. I guess it's a duopoly, because there's a new hotel in town, which I also understand is really expensive compared to the Nassau Inn. But I was thinking about, like, to renovate the Nassau Inn is so costly. It was cheaper probably to rebuild the new hotel, and then to renovate the old. And then they have a monopoly, and they're, you know, so they don't have a huge incentive to do so. But even if they wanted to, it'd be very costly. So when you were the first mover with that very old technology, it's much more expensive than if you're building from new, which many other countries are building from new. So I will say that. But we have to get our act together. I think there's no question. So in this conversation, I am reviewing Ezra Klein's new book with Derek Thompson called Abundance. So it's sort of motivated by the abundance movement, but it's his take he zeroes in. As you can read in my foreign affairs review when it comes out, which is not done, so it hasn't been submitted, but it will, is like, I do recommend it. I don't think they have the answer to everything, but it is very much on this notion that a lot of our policies have been focused on increasing the demand and subsidizing demand, help people to buy the house houses, like, housing subsidies, the EV subsidies when we don't have charging stations. And we don't have, subsidies when you have subsidies for scarce goods, what do is you are increasing demand for it. And if you don't have the supply response as well, you're not actually helping anybody. And so they use housing as an example, high-speed rail, which also comes down to not having enough government capacity and relying on contractors, and you're not coordinating. But also all of these local regulations, and you have a lot of interests. So Atif mentioned the houses that had to move for Princeton and all the drama around moving, what to do with these iconic houses, these historic houses. We have so many interest groups, which is, they develop to protect people from government. And so I'm not going to stand here and say like, oh, they're all bad. But when you add them up together, it can be impossible to figure out the way forward, right? If we're going to create the EV charging stations, if we're going to create the increased capacity in our electrical grid, if we're going to create high-speed rail, we're going to have to repurpose some land. And that land is owned by somebody, or it's protecting some animal, or there's going to be consequences, and somebody will be a loser in making that investment. And we're not good at sort of saying, as a society, we don't have a social planner, saying, as a society, yes, there are going to be winners and losers, but on net, we are all going to gain. And so how do you create that abundance? How do you create that way of saying, a lot of our institutions were built for a different day, for a different problem. How do we then have institutions that are built to solve the problems of today?
If that's the real bottleneck, then...
That's the bottleneck. That's the subject of my class next fall.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Cece. We'll open up for questions. So we can have Mitch.
A couple of points that I would love you to... first of all, it's really great to hear somebody speak so practically about economics, Cece. So it's really wonderful, because obviously you were put into a role where you had to solve complex problems, right? So where you stand depends on where you sit.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So number one, we had some presentations related to actually something I did for my senior thesis back in 1977 for Fred Greenstein, which is all the accumulated strings that get attached to federal grant programs such that nothing is ever shovel-ready, including Davis-Bacon, and which actually has an origin as a racist policy to import urban wages into rural areas so that black workers couldn't compete, right? And it still exists because, according to Aaron Wildowski and some other theorists, these embedded interests get around anything that's attached to anything, and then you can't get rid of it, right? And then it interferes with the underlying purposes of so that's how much of an issue, my first question related to that is how much of an issue was that in trying to, come up with these huge programs? Was it ever considered appropriate to do like block grants associated with some of these large programs that occurred during the Biden administration to try to avoid some of these strings that clog up the implementation? That's first question. Second question relates to, actually it's just a comment for the work you're going to be doing at Brookings. Because Chris Grieg here has the Rapid Switch initiative, which is really one of the first practical, first academic approach to practicality in the energy transition, and goes through a lot of the things that you were just mentioning, which is eminent domain, so that we can build out the grid. So you might find that you could coordinate between your Brookings initiative and the work here being done at Rapid Switch. So I guess I just have the one question on the, getting around that and how you tried to do it, or maybe you didn't do it.
So I don't know that block granting would have solved right? Because you can argue, and I'm not going to stand up here and defend everybody to death here, but I use death a lot today. But block granting would have said we're going to give each governor, and then the governors are going to do what they will, and you could put some strings around it. But not a lot. I think the feeling was, look, especially if it's a national security concern, you don't want to give them that kind of latitude, right? Because you can give them the block grant, they could spend it on pre-K, which we would have been in favor of too, but it's very different than what we were trying to achieve here. So I think the issue with the block granting is it may have been too diffuse, and if we had to do it everywhere, if you look at where they were doing the investments, there was a lot of investments in parts of the country where you don't typically see those kinds of investments, and where they may not have, and where the private sector may not on its own have been incentivized to go. I know that there was a view that we wanted the private sector to see they had to have some view that they could make this work. But there was an attempt to say we want to really kind of entice you and do some studying on where do we think are reasonable places we can locate these plants, and with the hope, there was some thought to where do we want to try to incentivize people to make these investments, because where do we see the greatest need? But we thought that they had the local assets in order to draw upon, and where there was some hope that it would succeed. Is this all going to succeed beautifully? No. And I don't think we should. I think we should all understand that. And again, I think that's okay. I think we should try. But I think block granting would have been a little, they were on a mission. There was a mission.
So Sophie in the back, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Cici. Welcome back. I have a question about the EU and the IRA. As you know, the Europeans were quite taken by surprise when they saw the IRA. So first, inside question, can you tell us a little bit about why they were surprised? But more importantly, is there a way to do industrial policy without antagonizing other countries and then provoking industrial policy in response from other countries that leads to a pretty costly race?
Look, one of the roles that the chair of the CEA plays is often chairing the Economic Committee of the OECD. So the main response I heard, at least from my economic counterparts, was, what about a carbon tax? Especially in terms of the environment, rather than going with these subsidies, et cetera. I think that the view, and you can take this or not, I think Joe Stiglitz, I think he had a slide on this, is it's not like these other countries aren't doing any industrial policy even now. And but we were behind. This was the view of the Biden administration, that we actually had been lagging behind. Other countries were had been doing their own. And furthermore, to the extent that some of this is in the national security interest, it's okay if they're going to do even more of it, like if they're going to do it too. So in other words, it's a rejection of everybody's doing just comparative advantage, and the whole world works on, we make the screws, you make the widgets, you make the screwdrivers, you make the hammer, and we do a lot of, everybody specializes. It's a bit of a rejection of that. And it is embracing that there are some things that we all may need to do more locally, and maybe not have to be in the US, but maybe where you so the friendshoring notion would come up. In other words, in countries where you can feel like reliably country to country. I'm saying this a week after Germany, but where you feel like you can rely on that trading relationship. We forget that you have to have a level of trust with that trading partner. Now, companies have their incentive to trade, and I get that that's always going to be below the radar screen, and that's not just government to government, but you still have to have some sense that it's suddenly not going to be completely shut off if you're really reliant on that trading partner. So I think that there is some sense of, if there's some responsiveness and there are some that's okay. And and I think another sense here, and the implicit trade-off in this view of the world, that it has been that all of this globalization and technology and sort of this chasing of efficiency has left winners and losers, but that maybe what we've over-torqued on efficiency and need to be thinking a little bit more, put a little bit more weight on the equity, and that if we lose a little bit on the efficiency side but have a little bit more on the equity side, that may be a trade-off that's worth having. So yes, we may increase prices a little bit, but this is the if, so this is the theoretical idea, but if you've generated if you've actually developed a local industry or a national industry, and if there are jobs and you've got more economic activity that's a little bit, you've generated some economic activity in parts of the country that really had gone dead, and you have people who now have work that brings them meaning and where they feel they can raise a family, and you have a lessening of these deaths of despair and this dropping out of the labor market. The labor force participation for white men has been dropping for decades. And it's a problem. We're not seeing it on the coast, but in parts of this country, it's a problem. People need something to do during the day. This is what Ann and Angus are talking about. And this is what Angus is arguing for, is like, we may have overemphasized having the bigger pie, that we are going to be able to have some redistribution. I'm not arguing against markets. I am not arguing and saying that everything, that we need to be completely protectionist and the government knows everything right, et cetera. That. What I'm talking about is a little bit of an emphasis here. So I think that there was some willingness to take some of that trade-off, also feeling like, it's a little bit like the pot calling the kettle black on industrial policy.
We'll let me take a couple questions this time. Yes, please. The lady in the back, yeah.
Hi.
Please take the mic, yeah.
My name is Nikita, and I really appreciated earlier on talking about industrial policy as a toolbox, but also a set of ideas and beliefs. We can talk about inequality, national security, just economic outcomes. And I want to bring it back to the question of inequality, especially, I think, building on that question, because for a long time, industrial policy worked very well in the Global South to catch up, right? We saw immense increases in productivity gains, real wages, real purchasing power. And now, as I think yesterday Stiglitz was talking about, national economic sovereignty and borders are going to matter more in a different way. How are you seeing between country and within country inequality changing as industrial policy also changes its form?
Thank you. We'll take one more question. There was a hand in the back. Yes, the gentleman there.
Thank you. Peter Calderon, former World Bank lawyer, working a lot on sustainable development with the bank economists. Let's figure out how Saliva gave the government a black eye.
Solyndra?
Saliva, yeah, the Saliva deal. And you suggested...
Wait, are we talking about two different things? So there was Solyndra, the loan...
Solyndra, excuse me.
Okay, I didn't know if you were talking about something else.
No, it's because I have a project with Saliva, excuse me.
Okay.
Solyndra, yeah, and you suggested that it was a lack of appetite for risk, but I would think that it was horrible risk management. You would never, as an investor, you'd never put all your capital in one company. But instead of investing $500 million in one company, they could have given 10 million to 50 companies or 50 million to 10 companies. What happened?
So I wasn't, well, actually I was there. Our former, Alex Moss actually was at OMB, did a lot of analysis on this, but it wasn't something that was literally in my portfolio, but that was not the only bet. Tesla got a grant in the same program, and that paid off handsomely. There were many other bets. So it wasn't just that all the bets were on one program, it's just that this was, and it may well have been mismanaged. I'm not going to stand up and say that Solyndra was just, a run-of-the-mill bet, but bets by definition are risky, and they're not all going to pan out, right? By just definition. For whatever reason it might be, they're not all going to pan out. And so I don't know what made Solyndra particularly stand out in this regard, but for whatever it is, it has generated a chilling effect, which I think is too bad.
It looked to be a big piece of the pie, even though there were other investments, $500 million.
There was the other question.
Oh, yeah, I don't have so much to say about that. I feel like the world order is getting very mixed around. You
were just in Munich, so maybe you can tell us something about
the world order.
The world order.
Yeah, I was. But I will just, Atif pointed out at the very beginning that in the Global South and developing country context, the aim of industrial policy has been growth and productivity. That was a little bit, I think there's a lot of concern in the U.S. that, we want to keep, we're all trying to be increasing growth, would like it to be more equitably shared. But that, I think it's really an imperative in what I'm going to call the global South. So I don't know to what extent, and I think the point was also well taken that our empirical base is inadequate here and needs more work, and we all should be part of that effort to fill in and to understand under what context and in what conditions and what can we learn from what has happened.
There were, so May had a question, and then there was another hand in the back. Any other? Okay, May? Can we have a mic in the front?
Thank you. First, lovely to have you back, see you here, home base. Cici, growing inequality is a huge problem everywhere, really, in Europe and in the US, but US leads in Gini coefficient than most of the comparable OECD countries. We're in the mid 0.4 range, where all the OECD is in the 0.3 or 4 or 2, right? Taiwan, where you just were, it was a 0.32, something like that. So the question is, and then of course, Joe Stiglitz talked about, the people, and you talk about who are unemployed, and you talked twice in your remarks today about, say, male labor force participation going up. I think the last number going down. Sorry, the last number is it's over 11%. Male labor force participation dropping by that much. So, of the industrial policies that you worked on in the Biden administration, was there any specific policies that's targeted at this group of people who Joe Stiglitz coined the phrase globalization's losers?
I mean, that is what the CHIPS Act was designed for. That's what the infrastructure, the bipartisan infrastructure law. So in terms of the roads and the bridges, not only do we need to fix them, but the view is that the people who fix them are these, I'm just going to call it what it is, white men who have, didn't have the same opportunity.
So a follow-up is that, have you seen, what are some of the early results, right? So, and then another question is, one of your many areas of expertise is education. Mm-hmm. Is there any policy targeting that sector, especially early education?
Okay, so many questions. So first of all, on the manufacturing side, do we really see a lot of movement in manufacturing employment? I'm not going to argue we have. But maybe it would have been worse. We don't have the counterfactual. And I think part of that was alluded to earlier, which is that manufacturing, what we call manufacturing, it has changed over time in this country too. So there are a lot of companies. I think Bosch was one example that I was hearing about, where Bosch is really the engineering and the innovation, and then they ship it over, the production and the manufacturing is done abroad. So the innovation on the value chain is on our innovation and the knowledge side of things, but it's not literally, and the service side of things, but it's not the literal manufacturing. So I don't know, and this was, I think, alluded to, as we're thinking forward and we're thinking about our economy and as it's developing, do we really want to be folks that, arguing for more manufacturing jobs as traditionally conceived? First of all, even in these chip plants, it's advanced manufacturing that's very capital intensive. We're not talking about a lot of jobs here. So do we want to be thinking of other kinds of, and how do we move people into other parts of the value chain that's more service-oriented, the innovation, the knowledge side? And this is where I think this goes, it's probably even beyond education. It's actually a mindset and helping people understand that what are the kinds of jobs that may be open there and in the future that maybe we can't even conceive. There was a lot of talk about how we help workers to take advantage of many changes, including that may be available in these, in and around, right? The whole purpose of industrial policy isn't just literally the bit of construction, but it's all of the supporting work that goes around it, whether it's the suppliers or the, the food trucks or, all of the things that go along with building that economic activity. But there was talks about, apprenticeship programs, having programs that are not fully, that are post-secondary, but are not about a 4-year college degree. There's a lot of talk about that. It's very hard for I've done 3 tours. I've worked on those policies in 3 tours. We have not cracked it because it's very hard to scale. It's very hard for the federal government to really put a thumb on the scale, because in the end, like let's take apprenticeships, that's largely been done in the union sphere, because you have to have a group that's organized enough to come up with a curriculum and know exactly what the jobs are, and then to tie that to the employers. Our workforce investment laws, WIOA is the current one, try to do that with community colleges, employers, but it's very hard to get that together top down. It's more of a local bottom up kind of an endeavor. Coordination may again be part of the role of the public sector, but it's a lot harder than it looks. So that is what we all hope. That is what we all understand needs to happen. The German apprenticeship system is often held up. And I don't know how people are feeling about it today, but it's often held up. But in the U.S. context, I think culturally where that becomes a problem is it means at grade 8 or some early age, students are put into different tracks. And that's pretty hard in our diverse, society where there's such inequality at the K through 12 level, to think that we're picking winners and losers among our children based on what they look like when they're 13 years old. And that's going to predetermine how they get. Part of the genius of our post-secondary sector is we give people a second chance. And they get to try things out. And people can be late bloomers, and they can then still go on and thrive and be innovators. But there's a trade-off there. It's a little sloppy. It's not as efficient as we might say. So that is very much a part of the conversation. I think it has to remain part of the conversation. I think it's going to be on steroids as generative AI takes off and really comes more embedded. But that's what we do. That's what our economy does. It innovates. Right? We went from agriculture to manufacturing. We're doing services. We're going digital. We'll figure it out. The speed is very quick. So it's moving very fast, everybody. But it is, I think we have to embrace that kind of change and understand how we're going to adapt to it. But we have to be open to the change. I think that's the lesson for me.
Let me come back to the geopolitical.
Oh, Munich.
The Munich, let me tie into Munich a little differently. So, if you remember when Obama won, he did this world tour, winning hearts and minds. We went different places and so on. And things seem to have really shifted since then in terms of it looks like what the U.S. attitude is towards the rest of the world is like maybe it's more either more protectionist, but at the same time perhaps more aggressive, that we're either going to protect and maybe stick a lot more. But what is missing in this conversation is, and USAID, we know what has happened with the USAID. There could have been an alternative, which is like the Marshall Plan version for the rest of the world, that the US builds allies by facilitating industrial policy in other countries in a way. You could have thought of the US having that kind of a policy, let's say, towards Africa. I mean, China obviously went in with Belt and Roadway, had other incentives, we can talk about those. But there's a failure of the US. I mean, for me, I've always been interested in development. For me, I've always found this like a big policy mistake. The US has this huge advantage that it can go and it can sort of be an engine of global growth. And in a way that, you're gaining as well through building supply chains with Africa and places like that. And there's never been an interest in that. And so I just wanted to, and obviously now it feels like a bit hopeless at this point, but I want to get your view and your opinion if that ever came up your desk, that this could be an option that you could think about, or it feels we have been too inward looking in the US when we should have been more outward looking.
So it didn't really come up because we were dealing with a global pandemic when we started, and then we had the war, Russia's attack on Ukraine. So I was there for 2 years. So so I was not in conversations. They may have been happening in other places, but at the highest level, there was by necessity, I think there was inward looking at the pandemic and what that was happening and whatnot. But I think this is, look, so I was at the Munich Security Council, my first time. That was sort of fun, being there with the national security geeks. But I was there for J.D. Vance's speech, and so there was a lot of, and Hegseth had spoken, Secretary Hegseth had spoken in Paris, I guess. It was a couple days before that, where he said, NATO, you guys have to step up. I was probably a little stronger because he had to then roll back some of the back. And then there was also a speech that Vice President Vance gave in Paris that I have not listened to, but I was told I should really listen to. So there was I would argue this, just like with, I think it's very hard to argue, let's take USAID as an example. I think it's very hard to argue that USAID as it was structured was the right way, the only way to structure the way that we do foreign assistance and foreign aid and engage with the developing parts of the world. I think there have been many papers written about how ineffective it is, what's the role. Clinton had considered rolling it into state. I think there's been many questions about it. Similarly, I think people would have long said, in fact, many of the Europeans said this last week, yeah, we knew we weren't stepping up. And we've known that we're going to have to step up in terms of NATO. And President Trump has been one who's really called and said, look, you guys are free riding and we've had enough, and it's time for you to step up. Now, it's been in a very, the timing is sort of interesting, where Ukraine is really on the line, and where, so I think the Europeans are feeling particularly vulnerable. It's economically a tricky time, because the fiscal space in most countries is pretty small for trying to figure out what we're going to do. So NATO, I think as a group, is barely at 2%, spending 2% of GDP on military, and that's because some of the Baltic states are way above 2%, because they're fighting for their lives and defending for their lives against Russia. And now I think people are viewing, within NATO, because of the threat of China as well, that actually the European countries need to be well above 2%, maybe it's something closer to 3, 4, maybe even 5%. And so where is that going to come from? So these are conversations within these different countries about their priorities as nations. And if, in the US, over 50 years, we've said we're going to have a big military. Social net, maybe not so much, but we're going to have a big military. In a lot of these other countries, they've made different choices. And so overnight, they are going to say, we're going to beef up the military, and what are we giving up? As we have that. And that is not going to be an easy conversation. I think you saw that when Macron tried to call this emergency meeting last week and they left with nothing. I mean, I literally heard the prime minister of a country say, yeah, that sounds great, but I got a coalition government. I'm not going to be able to make this happen. So there's a lot of rebalancing, and there's going to have to be a lot of rethinking about the geopolitics. In some ways, somebody said to me, who has done more for uniting Europe? There's Putin, I can't remember, and Trump, right? Because he's made it in terms of NATO, it's now become, Europe is like, oh my gosh, we're on our own. We don't even know how much we can count on the US. And that may do more to unite Europe than almost anything else. And so maybe they'll finish this project of unification on the currency. I don't know. We'll see. But I think that's what it's setting up. We will see this is early days. I keep reminding everybody we're 4 weeks in on the Trump administration. They are 1 week in on the whole reset of U.S. and NATO. These are early days, but there's no question that this is a moment. It's an inflection point. I wholeheartedly support. I think he was just there. The comment that with Doge, which is, I will say, I think it's a heartless, cruel, and I think there's going to be much casualty as a result of the way that this is happening. And I will say this is being taped. I will say this: if this is the only way we get reform in the federal government, shame on us. There has to be a better way that we build our systems and our institutions so that we're doing the assessment and we're willing to let go of things that we don't think are working. Because I don't think anybody's going to stand up here and say that our federal government was, whatever their dismantling was being done in a perfectly, efficient, effective way that was protecting everybody. I'm not trying to argue that this is the right way to do it, but it's shame on us if this is the only way that we can get some change. So now, what do I think that this leaves for us, because it's being done, is what is the way forward? And I think this is what this room is about, and I think this is what I think Brookings is about, and other places where we do research and we have time to think creatively, is what is the right way to do foreign aid? What is the right way that we should be delivering? What is the role of the federal government and Department of Education, which already I'm hearing some members of Congress saying, whoa, we get to vote on whether the Department of Education stands. So there's going to be an order debate there, I think. But I think that those are the right conversations for us to be having. And I think it's our opportunity. We should take this as an opportunity to use, instead of just sitting around saying they're all doing it wrong, like what are our ideas, and finding effective ways to get it to the decision makers about what is the right way to build it. Because they're going to have to build back. So this is zero-based budgeting. They cut it to the bone, but they're going to have to do a lot of these services in some way. That's just going to be the reality, and we're all going to figure it out. And there can be better ways of doing it, is my view. And we should be there to help and to be part of the solution.
Thank you, Cece. I mean, this is a good way of summarizing everything, right? I mean, there's a consensus across the board that the system is broken, but huge divisions in how to move forward. And so that is sort of the key question. Hopefully we can think about it in an educated way rather than sort of in some chaotic way. But with that hope, I know Cece has a hard stop as well. Cece, thank you so much for giving us the time.
It's been a pleasure.